So first off, I want to apologize. Okay, I want to apologize. Let's put our money where our heart is. Absolutely. And if someone can post those links, thank you. I just want to apologize. I'm exhausted today. All right. So I don't know if anyone can feel that I'm exhausted today because, I spend, really the night up, not just because I lost my material at 12:30 that I had written for y'all and, but just because the sense of the pain of so many people around the world, and in the sense of people just worrying about, how am I going to meet my most basic needs, right? And the feeling of people not breathing, and then the feeling of all the suffering that we ignore in so many ways, right? All the people that were dying before COVID, and somehow it got into my heart. It's always in my heart. I always feel it, but usually I can kind of hold the joy, right, and the tears at the same time. And somehow last night the tears overwhelmed me, and just the pain of it all. And I just screamed to God, right? Like, take my hand. Like, we got to do this. We got to change this. We got to create, these new memes. And God said to me, right? Oh my God, right? Oh my God, I'm going to do it with you. I'm going to do it with you. I'm going to do it with every, right? And we got to scream to God in the middle of the night. And we reach our hand out. We say, God, do it with us. And God says, I'm going to do it with you. I'm going to do it with you. We're not alone in the cosmos. Right? Reality is a love story. The love intelligence that created mitosis and meiosis before there was ever a human neocortex is pulsing and beating at this moment. And so we're together. We're together with Case. We're together with Barbara. We're together with every human being that's ever reached for love. We're part of the same field and we're holding hands. And we can do this together. Okay? So you're ready to dive in? So if you're ready, give me a yes in the chat box. There we go. Okay, there we go. Here we go. So I'm going to go slow. We got a yes. We got a yes. Are we good? We got a yes. 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 Let's yes. That's yes. That's yes. Let's yes. Okay. So, and I'm going to go not in any particular order, and I'm going to try and make sense of this. We're now engaging in sense making, and we're addressing sense making as part of the structure of the intimate universe. The intimate universe means that there's a field of intimacy, that we're allured to each other, right? That love is not ordinary, merely between humans, that love is outrageous. It's the quality and eros of cosmos itself. When love awakens at the human level, a new dimension enters. Love becomes conscious of itself in us. Love is not an automatic allurement, as the interior scientists said. It's not a structural allurement of cosmos like it is between atoms and protons and neutrons and electrons, right? Love is actually a choice that we make. We choose to activate the love. And we can't activate the love without trust. Right? Love and trust are intrinsically related. I cannot love you if I don't trust you, right? My love breaks down. I can feel for you. I can be empathetic for you, but I can't have that outrageous love where we come together and we create radical union and we're holding hands and we have this sense of liberation from loneliness and we're held by each other, right? That love that makes reality self-evidently good, right? That love that activates the best in us. That love that makes us know that it's all worthwhile, right? That it was all intended, right? That I'm chosen, that I'm needed, that I'm desired. That love that I can rest in, that doesn't exist without trust. Trust is based on the ability, right, to share information. And to share information in a way where we're both looking at the same picture. We both have a shared vision, right? So for example, often, right, I mentioned last week when I'll work with a couple, I'll realize, right, the problem is they don't have a shared story. They've got different pieces of information. They're interpreting the information differently. And although they seem to be living in the same universe, they're living in the same home, but actually they've got a completely different view of reality because either they're holding different pieces of information that are not available to each other, right? Or they're reading the information that is available in completely different ways. And those different readings completely affect all the choices they make. So that's true in the world of our personal intimacy. And it's also true in the intimate universe. To have an intimate universe, we need a shared story, right? The reason we need a shared story is because we don't have a shared story. We don't have a shared field of value. We don't have a shared sense of who we are and where we are and what there is to do and why we're here. You get all of those, everyone? Where we are, why we're here, who am I, and what's there to do, right? Those core narratives, and we can't create intimacy, right? Then we have a global intimacy disorder, okay? Now, one of the expressions of the global intimacy disorder is the breakdown of narratives. So we've deconstructed all stories. So we don't have those narratives of identity. Who am I, right? Where am I, right? What's there to do? Why am I here, right? I'm a unique expression of outrageous love. Who? Universe is a love story. Where? What's to do? My outrageous act of love, right? Why am I here? To commit those outrageous acts of love and to partner in the evolution of love, right? When I have that, and we hold that together, then we can see each other, we can understand each other. So that begins to heal the global intimacy disorder. The second piece in healing the global intimacy disorder is to actually look at actual information and be able to make sense of the information that's out there. So let's take this moment right now. At this moment right now, so there's a pandemic, right? It's called COVID-19, SARS-2, right? A virus. But even that is contested, right? You know, I saw a video the other day of a particular meme put into culture, and I'm not going to mention particular names here, where a popular conspiracy theorist who's quite intelligent made what on the face of it would seem to be a compelling claim. And he says, there is no virus. Not that people aren't dying. I want to make that clear. He's not saying people aren't dying. People clearly are dying. But he makes the argument, right, for a series of reasons that I'll get to later, that there's actually not a virus, that there's actually natural genetic material that's been poisoned, you know, by 5G. 5G is the new technology, communications technology after 4G, right? He makes the argument that actually what's actually happening is the normal biological terrain, genetic material, right, that's poisoned by, right, 5G actually has the precise same structure as COVID-19 and cites what seem to be, you know, what he claims to be our authorities. 7 million people, right, watch the clip. And all of a sudden you have confusion. Like, what's actually going on here, right? Is there, right, a SARS-2 virus, or are people getting killed by something else? Is it being caused by 5G? And is 5G part of a, as he claims, right, a larger operation? And that the purpose of this larger operation is to, right, create the necessity for vaccines. That's the second claim. So in other words, there's going to be this poisoning of enough people that will then trigger a necessity for vaccines. And then step 3, vaccines will then carry the nanobots that will link people into this emergent AI, artificial intelligence, so that people will be appropriately, right, ordered and controlled, right, in the world, right? Is that what's happening? So there are millions of people in the world who are at least listening and are raising this as a viable possibility. Right? Wow, right? Is that true? Is that a crazy conspiracy theory? Is that a legitimate conspiracy theory? Right, number 1. Right, and I'm going to just tell you in advance, I think it's not true, right, for, you know, a number of reasons, right? So I think it's false, right? And I'll explain why, right? But let's try and get this though, right? Right, all of a sudden, right, you've got this, and I'll get to this specific issue, you know, a little later, but I want you to get it like, wow, right? How do I actually navigate, right? Are there false flags? There's another possibility that's been raised. The other possibility that's been raised is that actually COVID-19 is some form of a bioweapon, right? A bioweapon released by China, right? We're at a particular moment in what's called hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare means that war is no longer fought, right? Primarily today, the major wars are not fought on battlefields. We have cyber weapons. We have malware, right? We have economic warfare. We have information warfare, right? We have disinformation warfare, right? There's multiple levels in which wars are now fought. China views itself as being in a state of war with the United States. And China has explicitly stated, right, that it's deploying, and it has deployed, hybrid warfare against the United States. The entire Belt and Road Initiative of China, in which China builds infrastructure in companies, in countries, right? But the building of that infrastructure is linked with, right, getting that country to align with China politically, and particularly with the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party, as I pointed out last week, is a bad actor. The Chinese Communist Party is engaged in genocides in China, in concentration camps in China, right? Is operating on a complete different set of values or anti-values that go against what we would consider to be the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? The Chinese Communist Party, not Chinese, not China, but the Chinese Communist Party have a sense of the ethnocentric intimacy, China, right, for China, and a kind of Chinese imperialism, right, which is very, very similar to what was going on with Stalin, right? So there's a continuation of Mao's legacy, which is very parallel, right, to the great brutalities of Stalin that killed 50 million people. The Chinese Communist Party is responsible for the deaths of several million people, right, intentionally in slaughter in the last several years, right, their own particular religious minorities. It's a big deal, right? And China views itself as at war, but a hybrid warfare with the United States. So is it possible that, in fact, COVID-19 either accidentally escaped, right, from a Chinese laboratory, particularly P4, that's in Wuhan, China, near the wet markets, and it found its way to the wet markets, right? Is that a possibility? And how do we evaluate that, right? Good question, right? So these are questions, right? How do we look at that, right? Or was it a purely natural phenomena, right, which emerged from this violation of intimacy, that is to say, cruelty to animals, right, and having, right, poor populations, right, eat from unsanitized meat. So it's a function of the fundamental intimacy disorder in the world, right? But it's not connected to the exponentialized intimacy disorder of a bioweapon, right? Or the super exponentialized intimacy disorder, right, of this kind of masters of the universe, right, kind of cabal, right, that is trying to, deploy 5G, right, in order to, right, trigger vaccines, in order to insert nanobots, right, a kind of, conspiratorial devil circle, right, that's moving us towards, right, this horrific possibility, right? And I've already said that the 5G, right, option, I think for a number of reasons is not true, but we're going to need to look at the complexity of it and what is true in the claims that are made, or what could be true, or what needs to be looked at. And in general, are things like this ever true, right? How do we look at conspiracy theories, right? Should we just take the news as we receive it, right? Is it just true that news is the news, right? And, we should take it seriously and we can trust the news and it's okay, right? And conspiracy theories are completely insane, right? Or actually, are there reasons to doubt the news? Do we need to actually check information in a much more serious way, right? And how do we make sense of information, right? These are all really important issues, okay? Just for example, I'll just give you one example, and I'm not going to put it in the chat box now. I'm going to put it in the chat box later, right? But just give you one example. So there's one video, and I'm not going to put it in the chat box now because I don't want you to watch it now. I want you to stay with me, okay? But there's one example of a video made by a newspaper called Epoch Times, which does a pretty serious documentary, right, trying to trace, right, very, very, very serious research, right, demonstrating the research done in China on creating a crossover virus that can cross over from animals to humans, right, and multiple papers published by leading figures within the scientific division of the Communist Party hierarchy, multiple papers published in the leading journals around the world, which actually demonstrate their ability to create coronaviruses that actually are, right, jumping from animals to humans. Right? And those papers, right, are extensive in the world, for the last 10 years, but particularly in the last 3 or 4 years. And then those precise people were working at the P4 laboratory, right, in Wuhan, China, right? What does that mean? So there's an enormous amount of legitimate information about that, which is actually real. Now the issue, Raquel, is not, are you convinced of it? That's the wrong issue now. So step back. We're looking at a much deeper issue, which is how we do sense making, right? Right, sister? So step back now. How do we do sense making? Then there's another series of articles, and Kirsten's going to put them in the chat box later, which actually are scientific articles, right, in peer-reviewed scientific journals, right, which actually say, right, that actually it's very clear based on this and that information, right, genetic structure, molecular structure, right, that actually this is a purely natural virus. Therefore, it didn't come from a bioweapon. But of course, right, there's other scientific information, right, that seems to indicate, precise match patterns in the amino acid structures of earlier viruses, right, which match precisely, right, in a way that shouldn't be possible. Now, you're a layperson. You're getting both pieces of this information. You get this, everybody? You're a layperson, right? You're trying to do sense making. You're reading and seeing these two different articles, right? One which makes claim one, right, which is, oh, right, based on the amino acid structures, it's very clear that this couldn't be a natural virus. And you read all that information. Then you read another article that says, based on another set of genetic markers, right, it's very clear that this must be a natural virus. You have zero way to do sense making. You get that? Does everyone get the problem? Now, I want everyone to get the problem. It's like, whoa, what do I do? Right? And then you flip on, a particular conspiracy theorist, right? And you see, right, him making all sorts of claims, right, about 5G, right? And some of those claims seem to make sense to you, right? So for example, right, there's a claim that, well, since we are electrical beings, which is true, that's actually absolutely 1000% true, right? We actually are in some, real sense, right? We are, organized, right, by, electrical activity. That's true, right? We're a biological organism, right? And the nature of a biological organism, 1000%, without question, is that electrical signals, right, are enormously important to us, right? They operate in our brain. Electrical signals operate between cells, right? And then the claim is made that 5G, right, is disturbing in some sense our electrical signals. And we hear that, and that makes sense to us. Well, that actually could be true. And by the way, parentheses, that could be true, right? It's actually, right, not true that there's been sufficient testing of 5G to roll it out, right? That's actually true. But it's also true that there hasn't been sufficient testing of 4G. Right? And as my friend Daniel has pointed out, right, the cumulative effect of all of our, right, communications technologies haven't been tested either, right? Because the nature of testing is that a company wants to bring something to market, so it does short-term tests. What company is testing for long-term chronic impact? Companies don't test for chronic longitudinal impact because a company is not going to test for 30 years. Let's do 30 years of testing. But without 30 years of testing, we can't actually see what the impact, for example, of 5G is. So can we say that 5G is absolutely safe? No. Could it be that 5G plays, right, with our, right, electrical signals, that it disturbs them in some way? It might. It doesn't do it in an obvious way. There's certain elementary testing that has been done. It doesn't give you cancer, right? It doesn't, in some immediate way. It doesn't do that. But have we sufficiently tested it? We haven't. But there's a far jump. So you hear that and you realize I'm an electrical being, right? There's new forms of electrical, right, or electrical technology, 5G, and you think, okay, those two are related, but then you make a bunch of jumps, and then those jumps are, and, right, the 5G people are bad people, they're devils, they're connected to, now you're making jumps, you get it? And those devils have been running the world for quite a long time, and they actually have a plan. The plan is to get vaccines, and the people doing the vaccines, they're devils also, right? They're bad people, they're devil people, right? This is a kind of, now we're getting into kind of a religious demonology. You get that, what's happening here? We've now taken pre-modern demonology. Does everyone get that? Okay, we're getting pre-modern demonology, as now we're getting postmodern demonology. So pre-modern demonology is the devil. You get it? Now, postmodern demonology, oh, that's the devil people who are putting nanobots in the vaccines, right, to link you to artificial intelligence in order to take control of the world. Whoa, right? Does everyone get that? Right? And Joy, I'm going to ask you, Joy, step back from the vaccine issue. I'm going to ask everyone to step back from the individual issues. I want to try and get to the deeper issues here. Does everyone get that? Sense making. How do I do sense making? So I want you to notice that a person can make a claim that's true. The true claim is we haven't adequately tested 5G. That's true. There's no immediate danger. We haven't tested, though, for long-term danger. And in general, right, we haven't tested, in general, our electrical technologies. And that's an issue, right? And then there's an issue of, well, why do we need them? We don't actually need them. We need them because we kind of like them. And they're profit-driven. And what's the relationship between testing and not testing and safety? And how do we actually accomplish that, right? You everyone get that? That's what we're looking at here. That's the issue here, right? So there's a partial claim that resonates as true, but then I don't notice that there's like 4 or 5 more claims that are made that actually aren't true. It actually turns out that the basic claim that the 5G sites map on where the corona outbreak took place, they actually don't map. There's quite a few places that there was a corona outbreak where there's very little 5G. Other places there's a lot of 5G, right? And very little corona outbreak. So actually the maps actually aren't right. But of course, when the person makes the claim that the maps actually precisely line up, you're really compelled. Turns out the maps don't line up. And it turns out that the claim of devils running the world actually doesn't have compelling evidence to it, right? There are leaps that are being made, right? And those leaps are actually paradoxically, right, magical thinking, right? It actually goes back to a pre-modern magical mode of devil creation, right? It's a postmodern form of devil creation and actually not validated by the facts. So I just want you to notice that there's a partial claim that's true, that intuitively recognize the truth. 5G, have we tested it? Is it safe? Great question. From there to the fact that 5G is poisoning people and there's no virus, not true. You get that? Not true. Actually, there's an enormous, right, cross-informational validation that actually there is a virus. People are getting killed by a virus, that actually the SARS-2 virus, right, actually matches the SARS-1 virus. And it's been tested in terms of genetic structure, molecular structure around the world, right, independently, multiple places, right? So the claim that there's not a virus just isn't true. That's just wrong, right? That's just wrong, right? So you get that? So, but we actually have to do some fact checking, right, to actually deconstruct, right, the partial truth, right, from, right, the larger context, which was actually a magical, right, thinking, right, regressive, right, devil projection move, right, in postmodern form, right, that got mixed in, right, with a bunch of, right, with a bunch of legitimate science issues. Okay. Right, again, so I'm going to say to Raquel for 1 second, viruses is a completely different issue. Right, that's right. Now, Raquel, this is exactly where the confusion happens. I'm going to speak to my beloved friend Raquel just for a second. Viruses are, of course, a part of us, right? So viruses are part of our microbiome. We're made up of viruses. Viruses themselves aren't negative. We just need to know some biology, right? Viruses aren't negative, right? But viruses, right, that become pathogens, viruses that pathologize, right, in a particular way, right, those are dangerous. Okay, so the problem is not viruses. The problem is viruses that have, right, found their way into us that are not aligned with the human host, right, that kill us. Okay, so let's make that distinction. Those are not the same thing. Okay, but let's get back in here. Okay, I want to go deeper in. So I'm bracketing. I just wanted to handle quickly the 5G issue so you kind of get that. Okay, you get that, and you get how the mistakes can happen and how you can take partial truth and extend them and mix them in with magical thinking. When Zach and I were talking about this, my friend Zach Stein, on Friday, let's make the following distinction. You can make a distinction between what we would call a pre-trans fallacy, right, in conspiracy theories. Does everyone get that? Pre-trans fallacy. So there's always, let's say, pre-personal and transpersonal. So there's 3 levels of consciousness. Everyone catch this? Pre-personal, personal, transpersonal. Okay, what's pre-personal? Pre-personal is a baby. It's pre-personal. I haven't individuated. Pre-personal is a cult, right? I have no sense of personal individuation in a cult. everyone get this? Everyone with me? Transpersonal is I move beyond the personal and I'm part of the larger community. I'm part of the larger field. That's transpersonal. So transpersonal is beyond the personal. Prepersonal is also before the personal. So both prepersonal is not about your personal individuated self, and it's about being part of a larger field. So a baby's prepersonal, they're one with the mother. A cult is prepersonal. I'm one with the cult leader and the doctrine of the cult. A cult's negative, right? It's a violation. We need to move beyond a cult into personhood. I need to develop beyond being a baby and to individuate as an appropriate separate self. Then after I'm a separate self, I go transpersonal. Everyone get this? And I become, right, a true self. I'm part of the field of true self, right? Does everyone get that? And then from the field of true self, I then re-individuate as unique self, right? So I'm now individuated again. And then as unique self, I join the unique self symphony, which is an even higher level of transpersonal. Did everyone catch that? How many people just caught that basic vision? Who caught that? Who caught that? Who caught that? You get that? You get that distinction? Who else caught it? Just tell me who else, just so I can feel you. Okay? Right? So there's pre-personal is non-personal and transpersonal is non-personal. But there's a pre-trans distinction. There's a difference between being in a cult, which is pre-personal, and in a genuine, for example, spiritual community that's transpersonal. That's the pre-trans fallacy. The same thing is true in conspiracy theories. There are conspiracy theories that are actually, and I'm going to explain you what I mean by that, trans, meaning they're actually taking a lot of information into account, and they're actually pointing out that there's a false flag going on. I'm going to talk about false flags in a couple of minutes. That actually X seems to be happening when really Y is happening, and actually because we're functioning as unique selves, we're actually doing individuated sense-making and good collective sense-making, we actually detect that actually there's something here that doesn't meet the eye, that there's anomalies in the story, it actually doesn't quite match up, and we need to actually be more intimate with reality and understand what's really happening. There's a false flag, okay? And a false flag means, right? A false flag means something very, very simple. There's a deliberate attempt to make X appear as if it's happening when really Y is happening. The word false flag comes from pirate ships, right? A pirate ship, right? The only way you identified a pirate ship was by ships in general in the maritime world, right? We identified ships by their flags, right? It was before all the modern modes of communication. So when a pirate ship would have the flag, let's say of Great Britain, they would hoist the British flag in order to get close enough to a British frigate, right? Then right as they were super, super close, right, they would pull down the British flag, right, put up the pirate's flag and attack. Okay, that's called a false flag operation. Does everyone get that? Now, of course, in that false flags, there was still honor, right? Because you didn't want to attack someone without them knowing who you were. There was a sense of honor, right, between adversaries. The pirates had this kind of rudimentary sense of honor. Today, the way false flags work is the false flags never pull down, right? So you often don't know what's happening. So a false flag means we claim X happened, but really Y happened. Does everyone get that? I'm going to give you guys a simple example, just a super simple example. Jeffrey Epstein. Right? Jeffrey Epstein. Pretty much everyone's heard of him. Was a financier, right? Accused of, you know, and convicted actually, right, of sexual abuse, right? Who was also clearly very, very connected, very powerful figure, right? Who actually also did a lot of good. He was a complex figure and seems to have been aligned with, right, quite a few powerful people in the world, right? He had an island, right? And on that island, quite a few people visited, you know, from Bill Gates to Bill Clinton, right, et cetera, right? He had a plane, right? I have one of the people that's closest to me in the world, right? You know, was actually a good friend of Jeffrey Epstein's, right? And talked about his decency and his goodness. So Jeffrey Epstein was a complex figure, right? And Jeffrey Epstein, right, dies in prison, right? And the claim is, right, and all the major news networks and all, you know, ABC, NBC, CBS, right, they all carry the major claim, Jeffrey Epstein, right, committed suicide in prison. Now, anyone who's looked at a whole host of anomalies, it seems pretty clear, right, and 99% of the people don't believe it, right, that Jeffrey Epstein actually committed suicide in prison. It looks like Jeffrey Epstein was murdered in prison, and it looks like he was murdered, right? There's always a reason for a set of reasons. In this case, that he had an enormous amount of incriminating information on lots of people in high places. So the false flag would be Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide in prison, right? Now, it's not an act of righteous faith to believe that. That would actually be non-intimate with reality. Because actually in our contemporary media world, like Jeffrey Epstein's lawyers and a host of other people have actually shared any numbers, lots of pieces of information, right? The cameras went black that night, the guard was off. I mean, there's a whole series of pieces of information, there's about 10 of them, right? Which indicate that Jeffrey Epstein actually didn't commit suicide in prison. So part of becoming intimate with reality is actually demanding, right, access to reality, not being alienated from reality, not having the news networks mediate between me and reality. I want to get closer to reality. I don't want to be alienated. I want to be intimate, right? So that would be a false flag operation, right? And so there are, right, sophisticated, right, moves of intimacy, right, which demand that we actually access information, gather information, and do our own sense making and not rely on what we're told. Right? That's legitimate, right? Now, that's different than a right, a magical thinking sense making, right, and which ignores all complexity, right, and says that, you know, makes up a very, very, very dramatic, fanciful picture, a magical picture, right, which says, for example, you know, 5G, right, is run by masters of the universe trying to get you to get a vaccine in order to put nanobots in order to connect you to the AI. Well, whoa, there's no compelling information to support that. Right? That's actually not accurate information, and there's lots of reasons to believe that it's not true, right? And there's no compelling reason to believe that it is true, right? So whoa, that's pre-modern devil projection, right? Jeffrey Epstein, right, committed suicide in prison, right? To believe that naively, right? Well, that's problematic because there's lots of information that suggests that that's not the case. Does everyone get this? And so this is called, everyone kind of get this for a second. This is about false flags. And Lindsay, and whoever's writing, try and write to all panelists and attendees, just so we can all kind of catch each other's comments. Does that work, everybody? All panelists and attendees. So I'm just going to give you guys a few examples. I'm going to go much, much deeper into this. And if you guys got some energy, right? You got some energy. We're getting started here. We're going to spend, and this is kind of just a gift to you. This is just, I want you all to have this. So this is for you, okay? And I want the sense-making structures of reality, right, to have this. So let me just list you just for a second, just so you get this for a second, okay? So just number one, are there false flags in the world? Yes, there are, right? That's for sure, right? In other words, in general, there are false flags in the world. I'll just, list you a bunch of them, right? Just so you get historically. Nero, the great fire of Nero, right? Which, you know, Nero wanted to buy, right? In ancient Rome, he was the emperor. The year was like 60, something like that, AD, right? And Nero, right, apparently, the best information is that there's lots of information that indicates that Nero actually set the fire, but the fire doesn't look like it was set by Nero. Nero wanted to acquire, right, a whole bunch of land, right? And the only way he could acquire that land was through setting this fire, right? So that's a false flag, and there's an enormous historical conversation, right, about that particular false flag. That's one. Right, number two, right, in the Inquisition, right, they burned witches, right? The church burned witches, but witches were a false flag. 1 million women probably were burned or hung or tortured in Europe, right? But the whole notion of witches itself, right, was a false flag, right? It was actually a move by the church. The church would actually take their property, right? The calling of a person a witch was often a political move, was often used against political enemies. It was at a time when modernity was just beginning to come to the fore. The church wanted to consolidate its power. The story of pre-modernity was ending. The church didn't know how to consolidate that power. So it did it, right, by doing a false flag. It was a false flag move to help the church consolidate power. That was the witch move, okay? Hi, my friend Sally Kempton's here trying to get something. She's trying to avoid this comment. Come on, that's okay, love. I got you, okay. Okay. So the false flag, right, the false flag, right, issue, witches is a false flag issue. The Salem witch trials, does everyone get that? The Salem witch trials were, for most part, a false flag, right? Now, right, at the time when the church dominated reality, now we look back at the false flag at witches and it seems silly. Does everyone get that? Silly. Witches? False flag? That's ridiculous. Who believes in witches? But actually, when the church dominates Europe, right, and the Pope is the most powerful figure, and the church's formal bodies, right, declare the truth, right, of witches, that's like science today declaring the truth, right? So we got to actually go back in history, right? So the false flag of witches made perfect sense in the pre-modern period. And it took actually, right, independent sense making, which quite a lot of people did, to realize this was a false flag. That there were lots of ways you could realize it. You could realize, oh, the church is making a political move. Oh, look who they're choosing as a witch. That's the exact person whose property they want. And that person was a political enemy, right? And et cetera, et cetera. There were lots of anomalies that would give away the false flag. There always are. That's a false flag, right? Number 3, just a couple of examples, right? The famous Guy Fawkes, right? The gunpowder plot, right, in England in like, when was it, 1608 or something like that, in which a group of Catholics are accused of trying to kill, right, King James and his wife. Right? That was actually engineered. It was a false flag engineered by a certain Sir Robert Cecil. We have lots of information about it. It was a false flag. That false flag, that gunpowder plot, changed the trajectory of English history, right? Big deal, okay? Pearl Harbor, I'm not going to get into this now, but Pearl Harbor was a very complex issue. Pearl Harbor looks like this Japanese attack, right, on the United States. Of course it was a Japanese attack. A false flag doesn't mean that America organized Pearl Harbor. Obviously not. There were many American heroes of Pearl Harbor. It was a great tragedy. But did America do everything it could do to stop Pearl Harbor? Or did American intelligence have information that Pearl Harbor was a definitive possibility? And there were a number of important forces in America, including Roosevelt, who very much wanted America to get into the war because they thought it was the correct moral imperative, right? So is there lots of information, right, that Pearl Harbor itself was not engineered by America. You get that? That would be devil, that would be in the pre-trans fallacy. That America engineered Pearl Harbor is ridiculous. But false flags are often when an event might unfold is not stopped or even, right, obliquely supported in order to accomplish a larger goal. Does everyone get that? That's a big deal. Now, again, we're not making Roosevelt into a devil, right? I'm not saying that at all, right? Who knows whether maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong. I'm not even getting into that issue. But that the notion that there's an enormous amount of information about Pearl Harbor, which indicates to us that it didn't exactly go down the way we're told the story. That's a false flag, right? The Reichstag fire, right, in Germany was clearly set by Hermann Göring, right? It was that fire, right, that actually got the president of Germany, who was an old World War I hero, to appoint Hitler, right, as chancellor. So the Reichstag fire was a false flag. Now watch for a second. That doesn't mean that Hitler and Roosevelt are the same. You get where it goes crazy, right? The fact that there's a false flag that might have been, right, a false flag in which Roosevelt was participatory, and there's a false flag which, right, was done by Hitler and Göring, who are evil Nazis, that doesn't mean that therefore Roosevelt does false flag, right, and Hitler does false flag, and they're both devils, right? That doesn't mean that at all, right? It means that Roosevelt might have done a false flag because he felt that the moral imperative of that moment was to get America into the war, and so he somehow allowed Pearl Harbor to happen. Now, was that right or wrong? That's a very, 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 very different conversation, and it's not one that I'm having now, right? That's a different conversation, right? How does morality work when we're talking about realpolitik? What does it mean to sacrifice some lives for the larger good, which always happens in war? How do we make that evaluation, right? That's a very important question, right? It's a very, 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 very important question. I happen to believe that if indeed Pearl Harbor was a false flag, I believe Roosevelt was wrong for a number of very important reasons. But Roosevelt's not Hitler. The fact that Hitler did a false flag in 1933, right, through the Reichstag fire, which the Nazis claimed was planted by the communists, which is what got Hitler appointed as chancellor, that's very different than the Pearl Harbor false flag, right? The King of Sweden in the 1890s, right, had his troops dress up as Russians, right, to attack a Swedish post in order to justify the attack of Russia, right? And Great Britain, right, and a number of the other Allied powers supported the King of Sweden, right, in that, right? The Nazis, right, had their troops dress up as Polish soldiers, right, in order to attack a German outpost in order to justify the invasion, right, of Poland. But let's bring it closer to home to those of you who are familiar with the United States, which is a beautiful democracy, right? There's a famous ship called the USS Maine, M-A-I-N-E, the Maine, that was sunk in the harbor of Cuba. And the claim was that it was sunk by the particular forces that people in the United States wanted to attack in order to take control of Cuba. Right? So the USS Maine looks like, based on a lot of information, was a false flag. It was actually sunk either by the United States or with complicit cooperation of the United States in order to, right, allow for, right, an attack on Cuba, right, which was, right, part of the agenda of the United States at that time. So the sinking of the USS Maine would be a false flag, right? 1907, there's a famous crash of the markets, right? There's a famous run in the markets in 1907. It was a, pre-depression financial disaster, right? As a result of that crash, right, several years later, the Federal Reserve was created. A couple of years later, right? That crash, that run, right, which happened, that financial meltdown, right? There's lots of information that suggests that J.P. Morgan, right, and Rockefeller, right, were actually both involved, right, in that crash in order to create the Federal Reserve. Now, that doesn't make J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller evil, right? It could be there was an agenda. Maybe it was a correct agenda to create the Federal Reserve. You got to look at what the Federal Reserve did. You've got to actually analyze what the Federal Reserve is in America. But there's lots of information that suggests that that run on money, right, in 1907 was not actually a natural event, but was a false flag, right? I'll give you another example. There's a ship called the Lusitania, right? Lusitania, right? A very, very important ship. This ship is sunk, right, by Germany, right, in British waters. It's got about 1,200 passengers on it. It's an act of outrage. There's a couple of Americans on it. And that was part of the huge push. It took a while. It took about a year and a half, 2 years for it to actually come to fruition, that pushed America to abandon America's neutrality, which was, favored by people like Joseph Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's father, right? And, right, it actually pushed America into the war. Right? This act of, complete German outrage. But here's a funny piece of information. Actually, Germany was at war with Great Britain, and actually German U-boats were sinking British ships, right, couple a week, all the time. Actually, Germany had taken, listen to this, advertisements out in American newspapers all across America telling people not to sail on the ship because it was going to be sailing through territory in which German submarines were sinking ships, right? And the United States State Department canceled or tried to cancel almost all of the ads. They didn't succeed in canceling all of them. One of them in Des Moines, Iowa, actually got through, and we have that ad. But we actually know that the Germans tried to actually give fair warning. We also know that this particular ship, the Lusitania, was also carrying munitions, right, to the British. So the Germans regarded it from their perspective, right, as an act of war. And we also know, and here's what's most important, that actually it had an accompanying destroyer with it, that a man named Churchill, that you might have heard of, who was then, right, the Lord of the Admiralty, right, in Great Britain, he had the destroyer leave, the accompanying destroyer leave the ship, essentially leaving it completely isolated. And in fact, the Germans did what the Germans, right, everyone knew they would do. They sunk the ship. Now, it's very clear that the sinking of that ship was in some sense or another a false flag. Meaning, right, the United States and Great Britain made a decision. And the decision was they were willing to sacrifice 1,200 innocent lives, right, in order, right, to bring America into the war. Now, again, I'm avoiding the issue whether it was right or wrong. I think it was wrong, right, for lots of obvious reasons. But it's a much more complex moral issue that needs actually looking at, right? Because in war, we often sacrifice large amounts of people. Right? But do we have the right to sacrifice people who are unwitting, who haven't signed up for it, right? There's a whole set of, corollary questions that we're not entering here. What I'm trying to give you a sense of, it's a much more complex set of issues, and actually false flags happen all the time. That's my point. False flags happen all the time. Someone asked about 9/11. There's an enormous amount of information about 9/11, right? There's an enormous amount of information about the Kennedy assassination, right? Lee Harvey Oswald, right, who was ostensibly, right, killed by himself as a lone actor, right, Jack Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald, right, cries out to reporters, and they catch it. We have the recording. I'm just a patsy, meaning this wasn't me. There was a whole larger play here. There's an enormous amount of information about the Kennedy assassination, which seems to indicate that that Lee Harvey Oswald and the story about Lee Harvey Oswald was somewhat of a false flag. I'm not going to go into 9/11 now. It's a much bigger and broader issue, but suffice it to say that there are, again, now stay with me. Now here we go, ready? There are people who do a devil conspiracy theory, right? Evil people, right, did 9/11, right, because the devils are actually running our world. That's not what happened in 9/11. 9/11 did not happen when the planes crashed into the World Trade Center. Or someone would say the planes didn't crash into the World Trade Center. That's absurd. Obviously they did. It was a horror in Manhattan. Thousands of people were killed, right? There were an enormous amount of heroes, firefighters, ordinary people. It was this incredible day that changed the future of the world in multiple ways. That's absolutely true. And it's also true that there is so much compelling information, right? That 9/11 did not happen the way the claims are, that I think we can say definitively that the public story about 9/11 is a false flag. You get that? Now, I'm not jumping to why did it happen? What were the motivations? That's an entirely different conversation. And here, very, very often, right, even the good conspiracy theorists make a fundamental mistake. What they do is they identify anomalies. Does everyone get that? Everyone with me? They identify anomalies. There's all sorts of pieces of information, right, that tell us. I mean, just give you guys one example about 9/11, right? What's called Building 7. There were 3 buildings that went down. Building 7 is a 40-story building. So the British news reports Building 7 going down. Everyone listen to this carefully. 15 minutes before it did. And there's actually a clip of a British reporter talking to his field person, right, his British reporter in the field, talking about the building 7 that's gone down, when you actually see Building 7 in the background. So clearly that reporter got information, and that information was, oh, Building 7, right, they got the story that they were supposed to report. There was clearly collusion between what's ostensibly a public media, right, and governmental bodies, and they reported on something as having happened that hadn't happened yet. So what often happens in very complex operations, not everything goes perfectly, and there's anomalies. Strange thing happened, and you realize, oh, something else is happening here. Something else is happening here. We need to actually look at that information. So there are about 20 such major anomalies, right, with 9/11, and an extremely important researcher named David Ray Griffin, who's one of the best scholars I've ever seen. I've read his writing extensively in scholarship. He's one of the greatest scholars of Alfred North Whitehead. He left the university as an act of public moral conscience, left the university, left being probably the greatest Whiteheadian scholar in the world. He must today be in his 80s, and actually wrote several very, very important books on 9/11, which are dismissed. George Bush himself, right, was threatened by the conspiracy theories, and George Bush says, don't let people, right, dissuade you from what actually happened and who the true villains are by conspiracy theories. Bush does this in a public, speech, right, because he was aware that actually there were lots of anomalies. So there's no question in my mind, right, that in fact, right, 9/11 was a false flag. But stay with me. That doesn't mean that the Bush administration's evil. Do you get that? This is the jump. That doesn't mean that they were evil, right? We don't actually know exactly who did what or how. It doesn't even mean that the Bush administration acted in some devilish, right, or evil way, that there were a bunch of lizards walking around, right? It doesn't mean that, right? In other words, right, what did happen is a larger conversation, which I can't have obviously in this short amount of time, right? But what's clear is, right, is that you've got to distinguish between you've actually become intimate with reality and you've realized, oh, there are false flags. To not realize there are false flags in the world is moral idiocy. It's not true. There are false flags in the world, absolutely, right? And to be intimate with reality, we need to look for false flags, and that's unbelievably important. But to go from there, from the recognition that there are false flags, is everyone getting this? To go from the recognition that they're all false flags to then claiming to know what the intention is of all the false flags. Number one, mistake one. Mistake two, putting all false flags in the same bucket. Some false flags might be appropriate. It might be important to do and deploy false flag strategies at key moments for the sake of the larger good, right? That's absolutely possible, just like war, as the Dalai Lama and I talked about in his room in Dharamsala a number of years ago. When he asked me to come visit him, we talked about war. We talked about we still live in a world in which at certain times war is necessary. We pray to move beyond that world. But pacifism, right, is sometimes immoral. It's a failure of love. To not challenge Nazism in World War II and to claim a pacifistic stance would have been a failure of outrageous love. We needed to challenge Nazism, and we need to challenge the concentration camps, and we needed to end the Third Reich, okay? So you can't put all false flags in the same bucket, right? Does everyone understand that? Right? And 3 is, you can't paint all the false flag actors as lizards. Incorrect, right? Right? These are all very, very important distinctions, right? We've got to distinguish between, right, this kind of pre-trans fallacy that's always at play. Am I doing regressive magical thinking, right? Or am I doing a much more sophisticated, expansive thinking and actually becoming intimate with the universe to actually try and recognize more clearly what's happening around me? Does everyone get this? Okay. So friends, Romans, and countrymen, okay? So I'm going to look at the time now. It's now 12 o'clock. I've actually just gotten started, okay? I've just gotten started with what we wanted to talk about, right? I feel like, and let me get a kind of show in the chat box, okay? Right? My sense is we should stop here, okay? We should stop here. Let's kind of hold here, okay? And tell me in the chat box, but give me like a genuine response. Do you guys want to go do part 2 of this next week? You guys want to do part 2 next week and kind of know more about this, right? Know about how it works, right? We've just gotten started. We've just kind of literally scratched the surface, okay? Okay, so we're just scratching the surface here. Okay, good. Now, this is right. This is really helpful to me. Okay, I appreciate the response, and we're going to bring it back next week to the current situation. Okay, we're going to bring it back to the current situation, and we'll apply it to the bioweapons issue. Right. We've already talked about 5G. We'll apply it to the bioweapons issue, right, directly. But we'll also talk, very, very importantly about what false flags say to us in terms of unique self, in terms of the universal love story, in terms of the intimate universe, right? All these issues. We need to look at all these issues very carefully. So what we understand at this point is that A, false flags are a reality, right? Number 1, okay? Right, that's clear. Right, 2, we need to make a distinction, right? We need to make a distinction between, right, pre and trans, pre-personal and transpersonal, between magical thinking, right, projection of the devil, and inappropriate ascription of motives because we actually don't have appropriate information that will actually support that, right? That's unbelievably important. We have to not lump false flags together, and we have to watch out from the basic move of conspiracy theorists, right, who are doing the pre or the projection of devil move. What they generally will do is they'll find an appropriate, they'll identify correctly appropriate anomalies. Then they'll do false pattern recognition. Everyone get that? All right, they'll do false paranoid pattern recognition, a kind of over paranoia. And well, they'll actually put the pieces together and they'll say, for example, because 5G technology is potentially not safe, right? And it hasn't been sufficiently tested, and it's run and owned, right, by a global elite. Therefore, and they'll make the leaps to, therefore, they want us to get vaccines and they're poisoning us in order to make us part of an AI infrastructure for which there's, right, not information to support that and a lot of information that moves against it, okay? So when you take a partial truth and you make it into a whole truth, you run into trouble. Whenever you take a part and make it into a whole and you make that leap, you've got to watch that leap very carefully. At the same time, now stay with me, at the same time, right, there's kind of 2 groups of people. Right? One group of people says, right, wow, conspiracy theory, and they automatically think it's right. There's another group of people, conspiracy theory, they automatically reject it. Both of those are moves for comfort. Does everyone get that? Those are both comfort moves. Those are not real moves. Both of those are an inability to live in the uncertainty. And I've talked to you all a lot about certainty and uncertainty over the years, but there's false certainties. Accepting conspiracy theories as they are without investigating and discerning them is a non-intimate act. It's allowing someone to actually hijack your mind, right? And you're no longer discerning, you're no longer doing your own sense making. You've given up your sense making and you've given it over to conspiracy theorists. On the other hand, right, the rejection of false flags and the kind of docile acceptance of the standard narratives offered by governments, universities, and establishments is also a non-intimate move. It's also a giving up of sense making, right? It's also an abandonment, right, of personal responsibility. It's also holding on to a false certainty. It's also a refusal to dance in the uncertainty, right? We actually have to be able to learn how to do sense making. And and we're going to talk about next week, how do we identify false flags? How do we distinguish between a legitimate and a not legitimate false flag? How does that apply to the corona situation? How does it apply to my life, right? Right? Why is it an essential necessity, right, for a person who is a unique self, who's a unique configuration of intimacy, to engage in discernment, to disambiguate, right, to clarify, right, to actually get accurate information? Why are false flags much more sophisticated today than they've ever been, and therefore harder to discern than they've ever been? And why is the obligation, the moral responsibility as a unique self to participate in the unique self symphony by doing sense making accurately? Why is that part of the moral imperative of our time? Why in our relationships between each other do we have to actually protect our own information ecologies? Why is sense making between each other so critical? And how do we actually protect the information ecologies that live in our own circles of intimacy? Are there false flag operations against countries? Are there also false flag operations against individual people, which are called smear campaigns, which are crowdsourced, right, on the internet, right, which is a form of a false flag when you try and make it appear that A happened when in fact B is happening, right? Does everyone get that? So we need to both beware of the false certainty of conspiracy theories that fails to make distinctions and fails to make a pre-trans distinction between a kind of pre-personal regressive projection of the devil, right, and a kind of sophisticated discerning of information in order to get a whole picture which accurately distinguishes between what we know and what we don't know and draws conclusions based on appropriate information, right? Those distinctions are absolutely critical. And without this, right, we can't actually, right, engage reality today, right? There's a new moment. It's a moment of decentralized sense making. And in this moment of decentralized sense making, we have to become powerful moral agents, okay? Right? And so we're going to end here. I'm going to end with the last piece. The essence of a democracy is that human beings can do sense making. That was the claim of democracy. That actually you don't need the king to do sense making for you, right? The House of Lords doesn't do sense making for you. The elites don't do sense making for you. Everyone with me? Who does sense making? Every human being, the citizen, is responsible for sense making. And there's two kinds of citizen. There's a consumer and there's a voter. Does everyone get that? There's a consumer and a voter. The consumer buys, the voter votes, right, for a candidate who represents, right, a set of policies and values that they're most aligned with. Okay? But to be a voter and to be a consumer, you have to be able to do sense making. Okay? If you can't do sense making, then the two structures upon which democracy is based fall apart. Okay? That's what we're going to have to look at also next week. What are the challenges to sense making, which are in the system? Some of them are false flag intentional. Some of them come from our own ignorance. Right? What do we need to actually overcome to be able to do accurate sense making, to be unique configurations of intimacy? Homo amor is responsible for his or her own sense making and for finding sources that are trustworthy, because no one can do sense making themselves. And that's what's critical to understand. We'll talk about that as well next week. You see, when we say unique self is responsible for sense making, we don't mean just you by yourself. You by yourself can't do it. You can only do sense making with a unique self symphony, right? There's too much information for anyone to be able to do full sense making today. That's how we began. You can't actually distinguish between, right, and Kirsten, if you can put those two links in the chat box, And everyone can take a look at them. You can copy and paste them. Put in the link of the Epoch Times documentary claiming that Corona is a bioweapon, and put a link to the article from a peer-reviewed scientific journal claiming that it's completely natural, both adducing scientific proof. How do you distinguish? So you can't do sense making by yourself. You need to actually be able to find trusted sources, just like we have trusted sources, right, in physics. But who are our trusted sources in physics, and what do we trust them for? Is every scientific journal that's peer-reviewed trustworthy? No, it's not. Just like priests weren't trustworthy per se, scientists are not trustworthy per se. There's dogmas in the church and there's dogmas in the scientific establishment. We need to distinguish, right? There actually is a broken information ecology. And in order to have an intimate universe, we have to repair and transform our information ecology. Okay, this was part one, right? It would be delightful and wonderful and gorgeous, right, to see everyone just for a moment before we go, right? Yay, what a delight to be with you, right? And we're going to continue this part two next week. We're going to take this to part two next week. And if we can bring some people on and say hi, right? Oh my God, what a crazy and wild delight that would be. Thank you, everyone. Oh my God. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.